Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Entry Level Esports. My name is Trent, and today on the show we're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart. Big start in Here's the Storm was not as a writer, but as a coach. And as a coach who wasn't a top-level player, I really focused a lot of my efforts and time on interpersonal relationships between players, working on synergy, working on rosters, and those sorts of things. And over time, I've developed, between that and my background as a youth pastor and with a communications degree, I've developed kind of an understanding of how to approach team dynamics that I think a lot of people in esports don't necessarily have. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in Here's the Storm is the importance of keeping a roster together, or frustration when rosters break apart. And this is especially true in the amateur scene where, rosters flip over after every single Open Division Cup. They flip over all the time in Chair League. Your friends will break apart after playing some Team League together. And so today, what I wanted to do was talk for a little while about how to deal with a problem teammate. So let's say you're in a Chair League group, or you're in an Open Division team that's aiming for the HGC, or you're a professional team in the HGC. There is always going to come a time where you identify a player as the problem. This is where the memes like Wubby was the problem, Fury was the problem come from, because those teams identified that, okay, the team is not succeeding where we want it to, and we've identified that this player is a reason why we're not succeeding, and if we remove that player, we're going to be able to replace them with someone that fits our team better, and we're going to be able to be more successful. So they identify a problem, and rather than trying to resolve that problem, they decide to get rid of that player. And so what I wanted to do today was to talk through some conflict resolution techniques that allow you to address a problem player in your team without it resulting in a roster change. Now, obviously, sometimes a roster change just needs to happen. It ultimately is the best thing for both parties. That happens all the time. But if you employ some of these techniques, you'll be able to have more fun playing the game. You'll be able to resolve those conflicts, and hopefully your team will actually end up stronger than when it started, rather than constantly shuffling through new players anytime you identify a player as the problem. So before we get into the ways to address a problem teammate, the first thing you need to understand is what actually makes a problem teammate. There are a couple of different things that could make someone the problem within your team. It could be a bad attitude, a player who's constantly negative. As soon as someone dies for the first time, they let out a big sigh, like, okay, well, we're probably going to lose this one too. Maybe they just complain all the time in scrims, or they call out other players for being bad. They just don't have a great attitude, and it's making it not fun to be around that player, or to practice with them, or to compete with them. It might be due to poor performance. You got a player on your team who seemed really great, and then over time, suddenly they're just not performing where they used to, or they're getting caught more often, they're dying more often, they're not healing as well as they used to, they're missing their skill shots more than they used to. All of a sudden, just their performance is not where it used to be, and it's becoming a problem for your team. It might be a lack of discipline. You've all agreed that you're going to get together on Wednesdays at 7 for scrims, and that player is constantly there at 7:15, or they're there at 7:30, or sometimes they don't show up at all. They just don't have that same discipline that the rest of the team does, and it's becoming frustrating for the team. And finally, it might just be that your goals don't align. And this is something that I've talked about before that I think I just constantly reiterate in any consulting work I do, any interpersonal conversation that I have with anyone. I feel the most important thing that you can ever do to avoid problems is to clearly outline your goals. But a lot of esports teams don't really do that. And so where a lot of the friction comes, especially in amateur teams, is that the goals of the players don't line up together. It might be that one player is really driven to become a professional player, whereas another player is just really, really good and enjoys doing this as a hobby, but is never going to want to pursue really being a pro player. And this is actually the problem that happened at the start of the HGC for Team 8, who then became Roll20. When they had Chu 8 on their team, Chu was a great player, and he helped them qualify for the HGC, but over time it was revealed that Chu just really didn't want to be a pro player and compete. He just kind of decided to do it on a whim and thought that it would be good for his stream for him to be in the HGC and for him to be more involved in the Heroes community in that way. But he really didn't want to be putting in the practice time to be at the top of the HGC, and the rest of the team wanted to compete at the highest level possible, so they got rid of Chu. Had they talked about that ahead of time, they might have brought somebody else into the team that was stronger than Chu, or that whose goals more clearly aligned with them before the season even started. And so it may be that a problem teammate is actually just the result of you not clearly stating the goals of the team before the team fully formed. So whatever the reason is, now you've got a problem player. Other players have come to you as the captain and said, we're really getting frustrated by Johnny, and something needs to be done. So these are the steps you want to go through to prepare for that conversation with a problem player. First, you want to actually identify a specific problem, because often it's not that someone is a bad person. You wouldn't have started a team with someone if there wasn't something about them that had value at the start. So it's important to remember that when a problem player becomes identified, there's usually 1 to 2 very specific things that are actually the core issue that needs to be addressed. And so when you're talking with other players on the team and you're preparing to confront this player with their issues and with having identified them as the problem, you need to focus on, okay, what are the actual issues that are at play here? Is it actually a bad attitude? Is it actually poor performance? Is it actually a lack of discipline? Or is it actually just that our goals don't align? It's usually only 1 or 2 of those issues that really are the core of why now there is a problem where there didn't used to be. Because if there's always been a problem, then you're just bad at forming a team, and that's an entirely separate issue. If the team was succeeding before and everyone was having fun and getting along before, something has changed, and so you need to identify what that something is. And then just quickly ask yourself, is this actually an issue that needs to be resolved? A lot of times when teams start to lose, they look for a problem player, but what they find is not actually a problem that needs to be resolved. If you identify that your flex player is the problem because he doesn't play Abathur, that's not actually a problem with that player. That's a problem with your drafting prioritizing Abathur with a player that can't play Abathur. If you decide that the meta requires you to have Abathur, or you as a drafter really need to be able to play Abathur comps because you've got a great Greymane or Zeratul and you want to be able to run those compositions, then it probably is not actually a problem with that player. It's a problem with your drafting that either you need to change or you get rid of the player and replace them with someone who can play Abathur. But hero pool is not necessarily a problem with the player. It could be a problem with the drafter, or it could be a problem with the meta that can be resolved in other ways other than just going to the player and saying, you need to learn to play Abathur or you're off the team. So find out, is this an actual issue that this player needs to be confronted about, or are there other things about the team that can be changed so that we don't actually have to create a conflict where one's not necessary? But if you've identified a problem that absolutely has to be addressed because it's causing problems with the rest of the team and the team is not meeting its goals, then you need to move on and figure out what needs to be done next. And the next step is most often going to be to discuss among the other players of the team and confirm, what is the specific problem? How do we want to go about talking to the player about it? What are the solutions we want to go about offering and suggesting? You're going to have a couple of private meetings. You're going to DM each other on Discord. You're going to go to a separate Discord server and have a chat about that player. And this is just what's going to happen. It's just very natural. I've seen it happen 100 times. It's entirely a reasonable thing to do. But when that happens, you need to make sure that you're focused on the problem and identifying solutions rather than devolving into gossip. Because essentially what you're doing is a group of 3 to 4 people are getting together to talk about one person. And anytime you do that, the human mind naturally devolves into gossip. You start to talk about, man, he's just dying more than he used to. Yeah, and did you see what he was wearing the other day? It was really stupid. Yeah, and he always says like way too much. It's really annoying. And you just pile on to all of these other things that aren't the actual problem that needs to be addressed. And all of a sudden you leave that meeting realizing that this guy just sucks and you've got to get rid of him, when actually it was one very specific small problem that can be addressed and solved. So when you have those private discussions, just make sure you take the time to step back and think, okay, are we actually talking about solutions here, or are we just having fun gossiping about somebody that's not here? You have to be really, really careful about that whenever you're discussing a problem player. The next thing to do is to make sure that when you finally decide to confront the player, that you do it at a time when emotions are not high. You do it in a safe, reasonable environment where everybody is focused on having a productive conversation, not on providing and pointing blame. So the general rule of thumb is just never confront a problem player right after a loss. You've been talking for a week or two with other players on the team, and you've identified that this player is the problem. You've all decided that you're going to talk to them about it, at the next practice. And then that weekend you play in a tournament and you get destroyed in the first round, and someone in the team messages you and says, screw this, we need to talk to him about it now. This needs to change. I'm not playing another game with it until we address this. And then you all get in a Skype call or a Discord chat and you start yelling at the player, and everybody yells at each other. They get defensive, and you don't actually have a productive conversation, and then roster changes happen. Step back, realize that our emotions are high and that you're not thinking objectively, and wait for a time when you're not immediately after practice, you're not immediately after a match, you're not immediately after some huge fight within the team. It's a time where the team is focused on having a discussion, because the ultimate goal of conflict resolution is not to get rid of someone. If you've identified that the problems can't be fixed, then just tell the player you've decided to make a change and move on. There's no point in bringing up all the issues and trying to solve them and trying to have a long conversation. If you've already made up in your mind that the answer is going to be getting rid of someone, just go ahead and do that. But for this sort of conversation that we're talking about now, the goal is not to get rid of the player. The goal is to change behavior, to go back to the successful formula you had before. So the goal of this conversation that we're talking about is going to be to address the problem and to uncover solutions and work together as a team with the problem player to create improvement and to rebuild your successful foundation so that you can be stronger and better going forward. And the only way to do that is to not talk about it when you're angry, when you're looking for someone to blame, when your brain just needs a reason that it wasn't your fault. You don't want to do that when you're trying to address an actual problem. So never confront somebody immediately after a loss. And then when you do finally bring up the issue, you say, Johnny, you've been dying a lot in game and we need to address this and figure out what's happened. Or Johnny, you've been late to practice a lot and it's really frustrating everybody. What you need to make sure that you do is take a little bit of time to prepare for this meeting so that you can focus on provable facts. Because what happens in a conflict scenario is the brain immediately wants to get defensive. It immediately wants to look for ways that this wasn't actually that person's fault, and they're going to look for any holes in your argument to invalidate it, essentially. And so what you want to do is focus on things that are irrefutable and that are provable. So if the problem is that somebody's late for practice, take a week and document. Write down when they show up. Okay, we typed in the Discord channel that everyone was going to be here at 7, and you agreed to that, and then you showed up at 7:15. And then the next day we said everyone was going to be here at 8, and you showed up at 8:14. And you go through 5 to 6 days and say, okay, consistently 4 out of these 5 times you were late, and that's causing problems with the team. If you just go to someone and say, you're always late and it's pissing us off, they're going to remember the one time that they were on time and say, no, I'm not always late. I was on time on Friday. And the other days I had XYZ valid excuse. So your argument is invalid. I'm not the problem. You're the problem. A general rule of thumb to think about in conflict resolution is that no one always does anything. If you're going to confront somebody about a problem and you're going to say the word always, you are actually the problem in that conversation, because no one always does anything. You can think about this in any relationship you've ever had. You always forget to take out the trash. No, I don't. I took it out fine 2 weeks ago. But you're frustrated about something that's been building up over months, and now it's a frustration, and the 1 or 2 times that it went correctly are irrelevant to the actual problem, but your brain is able to feel like I'm not actually the problem if you can poke holes in the argument, and nobody always does anything. It's an exaggeration that makes it seem not serious and not real. So you need to avoid that word and focus on specific things that can be solved. Okay, we're going to look at the last 15 games, and their tank, whether we win or lose, you have on average 3 more deaths than their tank. You are consistently dying too much. There are a couple games in here where you played really well, but overall we've noticed that you've been dying more frequently than the enemy tank, and we want to discuss, is it a positioning issue? Is the healing not coming where it needs to be? Are we not prioritizing the right fights? We've identified that the problem that we're encountering is that you are dying more frequently in most of our games, and we want to address that. It's a provable fact, backed up by data. You're not just saying you always XYZ. You're focusing on one specific problem, and you're explaining to the player, we want to find a solution. So, focus on provable facts. Take the time to actually research provable facts before you get into an issue. You can do the same thing even if it's a bad attitude problem. Take notes, write things down, get specifics. In our last scrim, we had 3 matches against this team, and in 2 of those games, after you died, you immediately sighed and said, well, we're going to lose this game. And that brought everybody else down. And we really just have noticed that it's starting to become more of a trend that you're negative as soon as something bad goes on in game. And here's all of these specific examples of when that has happened. And to that end, you want to focus on I feel statements. You want to focus on how someone's actions affected your emotions rather than trying to tell them what their intentions were. This is also very useful for any conflict resolution in any aspect of your life, whether it's a relationship, it's your kid, it's your parent, it's your best friend, whatever it might be. This is one of the easiest ways that conflict resolution goes wrong, is when you try to tell someone what their intentions are. You are always late to practice because you don't respect the team and you're not as committed as we are. You don't actually know that. You're not in that person's head. You're not in their life. You probably don't even live near them. You know them very, very little for the most part if you're playing on a team online together. You don't know, maybe they, have money issues and have been on the phone every night talking to the bank and can't get to practice, but they're not wanting to share that with the team because they don't want to bring up their issues with the rest of the team. Maybe they just are really bad at time management and they're just a person who is always late. And it has nothing to do with disrespect and it has nothing to do with a lack of commitment. They just don't know how to functionally be on time. There's a lot of people like that in the world that are not bad people. They just literally can't be on time to anything. That's entirely possible. But for you to say to someone, because of this action, I know for a fact you're not committed, or I know for a fact that you don't respect me, or I know for a fact that you don't care anymore, you don't know that. So focus on how it makes you feel. When you are late every single time to practice, for the last 10 days, I've documented it in every practice you've been late by at least 15 minutes. It makes me feel like you don't care about this team as much as I do, and that frustrates me because I care about this team a lot, and I want everybody on the team to care. And then you give them an opportunity to respond and say, I didn't realize it was making you feel that way. Here's the situation as to why I'm late. And then you work through a solution. You focus on how their actions affect you rather than what their actions mean about them. And you give them an opportunity to recognize that, reflect, and move on. And that last part, giving them an opportunity, is one of the most important parts of any conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is not about you yelling at someone and getting yourself to feel better. The word resolution in there is a big part of it. You're actually looking to resolve a conflict, not just yell at someone. So if you're going to do that, you need to give the problem player a chance to respond, and you need to treat their input as if it has value. You lay out the facts, you explain how those facts have affected your emotions and feelings, and then you shut up and you give them a chance to respond. And whatever they say, you let them have it, you let them get out that, you stay focused on the topic at hand, and then you respond based on what they said, and you value what they said. So if you say, I'm late, you're late for the last 10 days, you've been late to practice, it makes me feel like you're not committed to this team, and then they say, hey, I didn't realize that it was affecting you that way. Honestly, 7 o'clock is just too early for me. I can't get home from work in time to be there. We need to change the practice time if me being on time is that important. Then you say, okay, how do we resolve that? We have to start at 7 because Y, or, you've agreed to be there at 7 and then you're not there at 7. So can you just be honest with us and tell us that you're not going to be here at the right time? You can go from there and talk about the actual problem at hand. It might not go that well, though. You might say, you're constantly late for practice. Here's the 10 times that you were late for practice. It makes us feel bad because it feels like you're not as committed. And they might just say, I'm absolutely committed. Here's all the other things that I do for the team that show that I'm committed, and they deflect away from the problem because they're bad at conflict, like a lot of people in the world are, and they focus on other things so that it isn't actually about their problem, and they shift it back on you. And you say, those are great things. I really appreciate that you do all of those things for us. However, a lot of those things don't mean as much when you being late still makes us feel frustrated in this way. We really like that you're a part of the team. We really appreciate all these other things that you do, but we need to address this tardiness issue and figure out how we can come to a solution that works for everybody. Bring them back, value what they said, acknowledge that it's real, acknowledge that their feelings and emotions have value and are real, and then bring them back to the problem at hand and say, okay, how do we address it? What would be your suggestions? How do we move forward from here? And at the end of all of it, just remember that no matter what, you're looking to resolve a conflict, not kick a player. And you want to work together with that player to find a solution that works for everybody rather than just yelling and getting rid of someone. So I hope that gives you some tools for the next time that you have a problem player on your team. If you'd like to stay up to date on all of our episodes of Entry Level Esports and be sure not to miss the next one, be sure to subscribe to Trolls GG on YouTube and follow at Trolls GG on Twitter and myself at Trent_Esports. We'll all tweet out when the next episode will go live next week. If you have any feedback or suggestions for the show or topics you'd like to see discussed, be sure to leave them in the comments below. And until then, I will see you next week.